we're here today to celebrate the signing of a historic peace agreement between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Republic of Rwanda.
Will the DRC-Rwanda peace deal finally hold?
We need the United States to make sure that this agreement holds and that you hold us accountable.
It's important to allow Rwanda and DRC working together because this is a very rich region with cross-border trade, with minerals.
Did Paul Kagame walk away with minerals and no accountability?
As long as Rwanda doesn't have control of the eastern part of Congo, Kigali will never rest.
Are war criminals now power brokers, or will they finally face justice? The One Africa Show breaks it all down. Welcome to the One Africa Show, the voice of the diaspora, where African stories are told boldly and unapologetically. Today, we dive into a historic yet controversial breakthrough, the Rwanda-DRC peace agreement signed in Washington under U.S. mediation. While headlines praise the deal as diplomatic victory and getaway to mineral investment, deeper questions remain. Has justice been traded for peace? Are warlords now shareholders in Africa's future? With over 6 million lives lost, entire cities like Goma and Bukavu ravaged, and generations displaced, we ask, who is being held accountable? Join us to unpack the layers behind the smile and handshake are two sharp minds. Professor David Monda from NYC University, expert in international diplomacy and political analyst. Peter Bigenda, speaking from Pretoria, South Africa. Alrighty, Peter, thank you so much for coming through. If I may ask you, beyond the photo ops and diplomacy, what should we understand about the nature or the true nature of the DRC conflict and the role Rwanda plays behind the scene?
Well, the true nature of the DRC problem between itself and the neighboring Rwanda, I would say it's ethnic. It is an ethnic-based problem that has been there for ages, probably from the times of colonial era, during the Belgian colonialism time. And I would like to say that the Belgians had a role to play in this, what we are witnessing today. And as we all understand is that if you look at the population composition of Rwanda, the Tutsis who are running the country, they constitute about 12% of the total population. And the Hutus, who are the majority, they make up at about 85%, I would say. And the remaining percentage goes to the Pygmies. Now, it is understandable that when the RPF, which is the ruling party in Kigali, took power in Rwanda, those who were in power in Kigali under the leadership of the then President Juvenal Habyarimana, when they were defeated, they fled to the eastern part of Congo. And therefore, Rwanda couldn't feel at ease, and well knowing that their former foes are simply a couple of kilometers away from Kigali to the eastern part of DRC. And therefore, we remember very well that 1997, if my memory serves me correct, there was an uprising in the eastern DRC, which eventually brought in the then President Desire Kabila, who was in exile in Tanzania, and ultimately overthrew the then government of Mobutu Sese Seko. Then the Rwandan Hutus, mainly made of the Interahamwe, they fled into Congo, and the reason they fled in Congo is because the then President Mobutu Sese Seko and the former Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana, they were very close. Now, as days went by there, then we saw when the then President of Congo, Desire Kabila, changed the ties in Kinshasa, whereby the Rwandans who were part of the government in Congo, for example, the chief of staff was a Rwandan. The chief of army of DRC, his name is James Kabare, who was a Rwandan. Then President Desire Kabila decided that these Rwandans, indeed, they helped me to bring me to power in Kinshasa, but time has come now for them to go back in Rwanda. Now, Kigali didn't appreciate that. We saw another war breaking up from all corners, particularly in the eastern DRC, and therefore, for a long time, as long as Rwanda doesn't have control of the eastern part of Congo, Kigali will never rest. And that's why when you look at this agreement now, Kigali says, well, and I think in my opinion as well, they have achieved what they all along wanted. They wanted to make sure that they crush the opposition party led by the Rwandan Hutus, based in the eastern DRC, called the FDLR. Now, that being achieved for Rwanda, I would say that is a milestone for them to have achieved. And that is why it has been incorporated in this agreement to say a joint committee or body, security body, has to be established promptly to make sure that they deal with this problem, the FDLR, and therefore to make sure that this group is completely destroyed. However, on the other side of DRC, when I look at the agreement, DRC has been a compromised candidate in this, because after all, we all know that DRC couldn't manage to defeat the M23, being supported by Kigali and Kampala, despite the fact that Kampala hasn't been vocal as Kigali has been. And the reason they haven't been so vocal comparing to Kigali is due to the fact that the Kampala hasn't been affected much as Kigali was affected, namely or particularly by this group called the FDLR. Therefore, Rwanda had a great role to play in this, despite the fact that they initially refuted to accept the fact that they were fighting hand in hand with the M23, despite all the evidence pointing to that.
Many have pointed M23 atrocity and the Rwanda alleged military support. Does this peace deal that's been signed essentially absolve these responsible for past crime, those who are responsible for past crime?
Definitely, the deal doesn't talk much about the plight of those who have suffered at the hands of the M23 and Rwandan troops in DRC. The deal simply emphasizes puts an emphasis on a ceasefire, de-escalation, and all of that, which Kinshasa, of course, had all along wanted, because the dwellers or residents of this region have suffered a great deal of loss. They have lost their loved ones, they have lost their belongings, they have lost their homes, they have been displaced internally and as well as externally, and therefore they had become despondent. For Kinshasa, in my opinion, has got little to celebrate, and the victims equally so. They have got little to celebrate because it seems that no one is fighting for their plight. And for those who played a key role in in the commission of those atrocities to be brought to the court, as let's say the international court or any other regional courts that we have. For example, in the East African community has got a regional court that sits in Arusha in northern Tanzania. Therefore, I would have appreciated much if this agreement had incorporated some clauses that explicitly pinpoint to the plight of those who have suffered during the fightings between these two opposing forces. But the fact that that hasn't been attended to, really, it leaves a lot to be desired, and I don't think even America is pretty much interested to see justice served in this regard. Therefore, I have no idea, and Kinshasa doesn't have the capacity to deal with it on its own.
From your perspective, do you think as justice being sacrificed for political convenience and economic interests? Do you think so?
I believe so. I believe so that justice has been sacrificed for political scoring. Because if you look at this region, if they haven't suffered from blaring guns and bombs and all of that, then it's volcano eruptions. This is what these people have been enduring all along. Therefore, and I wouldn't blame much Kinshasa. Kinshasa finds itself in a very compromising position. For example, they had to surrender some mining rights to the American authorities and everyone who is interested in Congolese minerals, because no one seemed to be interested to come on board to assist the Congolese, despite the fact that there were some initial efforts done from East African community, the SADC, the Southern Development Community. The impact was quite minimal. We saw how South African soldiers, Tanzanian soldiers, Malawian soldiers lost their lives in DRC trying to assist the Congolese. But the army itself in Congo seemed to be into disarray in a sense that they don't seem to be ready to defend their territory, to defend the integrity of their territory and to defend her people. And therefore it became difficult for these outsiders who came on board in order to assist, including the Burundians. Unfortunately, they couldn't. They were pushed back. And therefore, Kinshasa finds that probably this is an opportunity for Kinshasa to regroup herself, to reorganize herself, and ultimately to be able to stand on her own feet. Other than that, it's very difficult to see justice prevailing under the current circumstances.
You brought in earlier about Uganda role. So let's speak about that. What is Uganda role in the conflict, especially in the northern Kivu? You got these Ugandan-backed rebels units also part of. Are they part of the peace deal? Do you think they were included in this peace deal?
They were not included, and I think there has been some setbacks in this agreement that we just witnessed, in a sense that those who have been directly involved in the conflict, for example, the Rwanda is very much interested with the FDLR to be neutralized. Kinshasa is interested for M23 to be neutralized, but these two were not on the negotiating tables. They didn't feature anywhere, and therefore I think, in my opinion, something has been missed here. Uganda also, we understand in 2012, for example, when the M23 was defeated, Some soldiers fled to Ugandan camps, and others fled to Rwanda. Now, Kampala has been supporting the M23 as well. And like I said, the main problem in this region is nothing else but ethnicity, who is superior, because Kampala is led by the Nilots, the Tutsis. In Uganda, they are called the Banyankole. The Nyankole people are simply the Tutsis. They're not Bantus, and therefore they wouldn't like to see the defeat of their brothers and sisters in Eastern Zaire. And that's why the head of the Ugandan army, who happens to be the son of President Yoweri Museveni, General Muhoozi, he mentioned it categorically that there is no way he cannot support the cause of M23. Therefore, for this agreement to have had a meaningful and lasting solution, I think everyone who has been involved in the conflict in DRC should have been brought to the table.
Okay, speaking of that, what impact could this deal have on civilian trust in governance and the rule of law in the DRC?
Well, I think to some extent there are some in some quarters in the DRC population who would agree with the government in Kinshasa that at least Kinshasa has been able to do something to stop the firing of the guns, to bring about the peace that has been sought after for some decades, especially in this region that we are talking about. However, trusting the government of Kinshasa has been eroded for many decades, because the DRC government is a fractured government whereby government institutions are not properly functioning, and therefore the general development equally has been neglected by the central government of Kinshasa. So people have got little faith in the Kinshasa government. The government of Felix Tshisekedi has got a lot to do in order to resuscitate or to bring about the trust that they so wish from their people. But I can tell your viewers that right now the Congolese have got little faith in the government of Kinshasa. Is not the first time, because this agreement that has been signed is not the first time we witness such kind of agreement. We have seen a number of agreements being signed and being broken thereafter. So it leaves a lot for the Congolese to be desired, and therefore I would say that they will accept this with the skepticism, to say that this agreement will last. However, probably because America had stepped in.
I would like to thank you for your time. It was really a pleasure to have you on. But before we move on, let's hear what the president had to say. The President Trump had to say.
The administration will continue to work closely with all of the parties in this deal and ensure the agreements are fully taken care of, and you're going to do what's in the agreement. We'll say you better do what's in that agreement, right? Because if somebody fails to do that, bad things happen. But I have a feeling that after 30 years, I think after 30 years you're all set. I think both of you have said that's enough, right?
For our international context or perspective, let's join Dr. Monda from New York. Doctor, welcome to our show. Quick question. Can a peace deal that omits accountability mechanism truly bring sustainable peace to the Eastern Congo?
It depends on how you define peace. If peace means the absence of war, then yes. But if peace, creation of peace does not include justice, then I guess you would have to say no. However, I think in this particular context, this war has been going on for over 30 years. And unfortunately, it seems that these what we call economies of violence, right? The reasons that the minerals that are there continue to perpetuate this dysfunction of the state and the intervention from foreign forces, in this case Rwanda and Uganda, to intervene to extract these minerals. If the intervention of the US and Qatar to secure those minerals will bring lasting peace, I guess you have to deal with that imperfect situation of there not being long-term justice, because it's difficult to see how you can have an agreement with Rwanda, for example, if you're going to persecute or go after the M23 and try to hold them accountable. Because let's also not forget that you'd also have to go after the FDLR and the factions of the Interahamwe that Rwanda accuses the DRC of supporting. So it's a very difficult and complicated situation. And let's also not forget, in this international context, that there's over 200 different militia groups in the region. We focus a lot usually on the M23, right? But there's the ADF that's been fighting, the Islamists that have been fighting Uganda, the proxy war, against Uganda. We know there's the Mai Mai militia and so many others. So it's a very challenging situation. And I must also add, just in conclusion, that a lot of the details of the agreement are also not very clear to the public. So we'll still have to wait and see long term in terms of how this will actually be implemented.
Are there any signals that the International Criminal Court will be involved in prosecuting individuals responsible for this war crime?
I think at this point we still don't know. But in terms of a diplomatic settlement, I think the intervention of the ICC at this point would be counterproductive, because if you imagine the ICC intervening, this really gives the Rwandese government, the M23, for example, no incentive to want to make peace. Intervention of ICC, if the rebel groups feel that they will be, prosecuted at The Hague, then they will actually continue the war as a form of forcing the DRC government back to the negotiating table and trying to get some kind of amnesty from the ICC. So I think at this point, with a very delicate situation, intervention of the ICC will be premature. However, in the long term, if the DRC government is able to get some kind of control of its territory, if the M23 is able to be integrated into the Congolese army, and if Congo and Rwanda and Uganda, let's also not forget Uganda is very involved in this conflict, if they're able to come to some kind of agreement, then you can have some of the perpetrators of the violence and the rebel groups sent to the ICC. The only challenge then with that will be, will you take it all the way to the level of heads of state from foreign countries that have been implicated in some of the conflicts in the DRC? And if you did, then what would the broader implications of that be in a country like Rwanda, where we know Paul Kagame, as an authoritarian and transformational leader in that country, has brought stability? If the ICC comes to take Kagame to The Hague, might that then also lead to instability in Rwanda and then possibly more ethnic violence and genocide? And then, of course, we have to think about Uganda and its history of instability pre-Museveni, right? If you take Museveni to The Hague, you're taking an octogenarian, a man in his 80s, to The Hague. What are the other dynamics of that? So, it's a very difficult situation, Mr. Chairman, in this context that you want the ideal of justice, but you also want peace. and sometimes these two these two ideals or these two goals are not always in concert, right? Sometimes they can sometimes be in conflict with each other.
Speaking of justice, there are reports that the M23 may be enrolled in the Congolese army. What does this mean for the national security and the justice in the region?
So this is a very difficult situation. Number one, because before, remember, in several agreements have been signed in the past. The M23 has not been successfully integrated into the Congolese army. And then the other question will be, to what extent will Rwanda stop supporting the M23? Because remember, Rwanda has been supporting M23 because Rwanda feels that it has to use the M23 as a buffer, right, as a proxy to go after the Interahamwe, right, elements of the FDLR, the Hutu militia, which are in the eastern DRC, and which create a lot of instability at the border between, Rwanda and the DRC. So, to the extent that the M23 will be integrated, to what extent then will Rwanda stop supporting the M23 as a proxy force? But then the other element that we have to strictly consider is the element of the Banyamulenge and the historic marginalization of the Banyamulenge, who are at the center of this M23 group, right? To what extent will the Tutsis of the Congo, of the DRC, feel that they are being welcomed as equal citizens into this broader politic that we call, the Congo, the DRC. Historical memory, even back to the era of Mobutu, the Banyamulenge, which are really the center of this M23, even in the era of Mobutu, have felt marginalized because Mobutu used the fact that they were of Tutsi heritage to marginalize them and to play the rest of Congo against the Banyamulenge, right? So this is an ongoing, and difficult tension. And I must add, excuse me, we cannot look at this conflict outside of looking at the politics of the DRC itself. Remember that Tshisekedi and Kabila are now at loggerheads. And Tshisekedi has been going after, Kabila, and Kabila has been reorganizing in the eastern DRC, talking to different rebel militias. So there's a power struggle in Kinshasa itself, which is also a very complicated dynamic. Because if the center is not in control of the parts, then it's very easy for the parts to be in disarray. And by that I mean, if you do not have a stable government in Kinshasa, there are high chances that these far-flung regions, right, the two Ituris, Bukavu, the eastern parts of the Great Lakes region, those ones will always be unstable, simply because the government in Kinshasa is too weak to control those territories, right, and to manage its territorial integrity. So there's a whole different range of different dynamics here at play, Mr. Chairman. Number one is the militias within the Congo. Number two is the interventionism of foreign actors, in the case of Uganda, Rwanda. Number three is the stability of the DRC itself, the government in the Congo. And of course, number four is the interests of US and Western multinationals, which are central to this deal actually being successful. And to what extent will the US getting involved in the DRC also be a Trumpian play, a play by Donald Trump to try and limit the influence of China in the whole DRC? So there's all this different range of different players, because part of the reason the US is intervening in terms of trying to access these rare minerals in the DRC is because of competition for these rare minerals that the Americans felt the Chinese were having a big access to.
Given the U.S. heavy role in brokering the deal, is there any plan for the U.S. military involvement in monitoring and to ensure both parties adhere to the terms?
So based on the mood here in the U.S. In Washington, when you look at the Security Council, America's diplomatic moves, when you really study the factions within the Republican Party, there is no interest from Donald Trump or from the general American polity, the U.S. public opinion very generally, into another forever war, particularly somewhere in the middle of Africa, a country like Rwanda or DRC, which most Americans can't find on the map. This was part of Donald Trump's agenda to stop intervention in these foreign wars. So I see American intervention in the DRC to be, if America was to get involved, would not be have boots on the ground. The most they would have is probably military advisors, but they would probably either work through a regional force like the East African Community or SADC, or a combination of the two, to have peacekeepers or a UN force, maybe an emboldened new form of MONUSCO in the DRC to try and you broker some of this peace. But I think that the intervention of the U.S. is really important, because heretofore we haven't really had major U.S. interest in the DRC in bringing this conflict to an end, and now we do, obviously because of major economic interests, right? And if the U.S. feels, or the Trump administration feels, with its very transactionalist foreign policy, right, there's very big material interest in the DRC with these rare minerals, and with the U.S. competing with China, right, and to some extent Russia, right, for some of these minerals, then will the U.S. use its diplomatic leverage to make sure that both forces, right, the coercive force of the U.S. diplomatically, to make sure that Kinshasa is in line and Kigali is in line, right? Remember, the U.S. can really leverage Kigali because of the aid that the U.S. provides to the Rwandese economy and the diplomatic isolation that the U.S. can bring on Rwanda if Rwanda does not play ball on the DRC, and similarly with the DRC. So the U.S. can use a lot of its diplomatic leverage, but the U.S. can also use a lot of its military leverage, right? As we saw in Iran, the U.S. has very advanced technologies, right? It could use its B-2 bombers, it could use some of its drone technologies, it could use some of its satellite technologies to actually force some of these rebel groups and some of these parties to come to the table. Because it's really important, Mr. Chairman, when you think about these conflicts, trying to enforce a peace settlement is futile if the parties in the dispute don't feel that there will be a backup, right? There has to be, you have to have a stick behind the carrot, right? So you incentivize with a carrot, but you also have to have a stick, which would basically mean if the parties involved in a conflict are not playing ball, if they're out of line, that they will get spanked. And this is part of the influence of the U.S. So I do not see the U.S. putting boots on the ground, but because there's a major economic interest for the U.S. in the DRC, because there's competition between U.S. and China for those rare earth minerals, I definitely see the U.S. as having an incentive and using its diplomatic, its aid, and its intelligence leverage to ensure that this deal goes through.
With the U.S. Securing mineral access as part of the agreement, how do we balance peace building with resource sovereignty?
So this is a difficult and very very difficult question. Peace building with resource extraction. So it might sometimes seem that those two interests might be mutually exclusive. They're not in concert. But I think to the extent that the U.S. will need to have peace, and U.S. corporations will need to have peace in the region, so that U.S. corporations and business interests can actually be able to do business in a peaceful environment, I think that will be a big incentive for there to be peace. The other question that we had talked about earlier about justice, I think that one is a lot more complicated. As much as to the extent that individual heads of states of countries like Uganda and Rwanda will be implicated in the pursuit of justice. To the second element, that pursuing justice in the DRC might also implicate some of the rebel leaders for some of these militias in the DRC. Pursuit for justice might implicate high members of the Congolese army who have been doing business with some of these rebel militia in terms of profiteering from the chaos in the region. I think then really creates very difficult space. But I think long-term justice can only be achieved in the long term when there's peace in the ground. And as long as the economic interests are being fulfilled, we always have to be hopeful, because we've seen cases where leaders that felt they were untouchable. Remember people like Charles Taylor, were Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia. They were held to account eventually, but that's very critical when economic interests and questions of justice come in concert. Then international systems of justice can really have teeth. But as long as major powers are not incentivized to bring justice because their economic interests are not in concert with long-term questions of justice, then justice becomes elusive. But I think justice for the DRC in the long term will be something that will come over time. Right now, what's most important, with 6 million people dead, this is an African genocide in a massive scale. And let's not forget the number of rapes and the number of displaced people, the internally displaced people in the DRC. I think to have peace at this time is something that that everyone on the continent is looking for.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that it's for today's special episode of the One Africa Show. If you care about peace, justice, and the future of Africa, don't just watch, be part of the conversation. And help us hit that subscribe button, share your thoughts in the comment, and support independent African media. Until next time, let's build the future together. Asante sana.